Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really going to try and cut through the noise. We're getting straight to the core of, well, a really pivotal event from June 2025, that recent Iran-Israel war. We've done a deep dive into a pretty comprehensive article, pulling out the key events, the analysis, and crucially, some of those hidden facts that don't always make the headlines. Think of this as your shortcut to being, genuinely well-informed about what happened.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here, I think, is how this really intense chapter, which, let's be honest, ended somewhat inconclusively, fits into the much bigger picture. We're talking decades of underlying tension, strategic calculations between Iran and Israel. It wasn't just some random flare-up. It was a major escalation stemming from that long history. That's really the context for everything we're about to break down.
Absolutely. To really get a handle on June 2025, you have to understand those deep roots first. I mean, decades of bad blood, fundamental ideological clashes, Iran's nuclear program, always a sticking point, and Israel's very real security worries. These things have been simmering, bubbling under the surface for such a long time.
Yeah.
It's the essential backdrop.
Exactly. And if you connect this to the bigger regional picture, like you said, it becomes clear this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was, well, an almost inevitable consequence of those long-standing, really thorny issues, especially that nuclear question.
Right. And the spark that lit the fuse this time, in June 2025, it seems it was Israel's preemptive action. Okay, so let's kick things off with Israel's opening move. June 12th, they called it Operation Rising Lion. Yeah. This was a surprise air campaign, pretty significant. The targets were specific. Iran's main nuclear sites, think Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, but also other military infrastructure. And Israel's stated goals, they were ambitious: dismantle the nuclear program, hit the leadership, and seriously knock back Iran's air defenses. Now, Iran didn't wait long. Their response came quick. June 13th, Operation True Promise III. They launched, over 100 drones and missiles toward Israel. Now, Israel's air defenses, they're multi-layered, pretty sophisticated. They did manage to intercept most of them. Damage was limited, thankfully. But here's the key thing our source stresses. This was Iran's third direct attack on Israel since just 2024.
Right. And that number, the third attack, it really raises an important question, doesn't it? What does that signal about Iran's strategic thinking, maybe their risk calculation? It suggests perhaps a conscious shift, a greater willingness maybe to engage directly, to cross lines they might have avoided before. The rules of engagement seem to be changing.
That's a really critical point. And Israel, well, they didn't back down either. They escalated further on June 15th. This time, hitting Iran's energy sector, the South Pars gas field, a big oil refinery near Tehran. Now, the source notes global oil prices did nudge up a bit, but interestingly, actual supply disruptions were pretty minimal. Then June 16th rolls around, and this is where things get particularly interesting. Iran launches another major missile barrage. This one did cause some damage in Tel Aviv and Haifa. But the really significant development, the first use of this new advanced missile, the Haj Qassem, why is it significant? Because reports indicate it managed to partially get past Israel's Iron Dome system. That exposed, potential vulnerabilities in a defense shield previously seen as almost, foolproof.
Yeah, what's fascinating there isn't just that it got through partially, but the level of technology Iran demonstrated. The Haj Qassem missile, even with limited overall damage from that specific attack, its ability to challenge Iron Dome, even partly, that sends ripples. It forces a rethink, doesn't it, about regional defense setups, future planning. It shakes up some long-held assumptions about Israeli defenses.
Definitely. So fast forward a few days, June 19th, Israel keeps up the pressure, hitting Iran's nuclear infrastructure again. This time, the Iraq heavy water reactor was targeted. Around this time, things get a bit complex diplomatically. Iran starts signaling maybe an openness to a ceasefire. But they flatly refuse any U.S. demands about halting uranium enrichment. That's a non-starter for them. And meanwhile, you've got Iranian-backed militias in places like Iraq and Yemen making threats against U.S. bases, adding another layer of tension. Okay, then June 22nd. This feels like a real turning point. The United States steps in offensively. Under President Trump, the U.S. joins the fight directly. Using heavy-duty bunker-busting bombs, they hit 3 Iranian nuclear sites, including Fordo, that deeply buried facility that our sources suggest Israel had struggled to significantly damage earlier. Iran's response to the U.S. strikes, it was largely symbolic, it seems. A missile strike on the big U.S. airbase in Qatar, Al Udeid. Critically, though, no casualties reported from that strike.
That U.S. intervention was, undeniably pivotal. It sent a very strong message. But what's interesting is how controlled it seemed, in a way. It definitely pushed things towards the ceasefire, but it also starkly highlighted the risk, the ever-present danger of the U.S. getting pulled into a much wider conflict.
And the psychological dimension wasn't ignored either. June 23rd, Israel bombs Evin prison in Iran. This wasn't about military capability. Even as Notorious holds political prisoners, it was a deeply symbolic target, clearly aimed, it seems, at shaking the regime psychologically, maybe stirring up internal pressure.
And this really brings up an important question about modern warfare, doesn't it? The non-military goals. Hitting a prison like Evin, it's not about taking out tanks or missile sites. It's about morale, internal stability, creating doubt. Our sources suggest that was definitely part of the Israeli calculus here, trying to destabilize from within.
Exactly. And then, almost immediately after, June 24th, the ceasefire is announced, brokered by the U.S. Now, Iran apparently violated it almost instantly with another missile launch, but things did eventually settle down. And predictably, both sides claimed victory. Israel pointed to the damage inflicted on Iran's capabilities. Iran, meanwhile, emphasized its survival, its resilience, and, crucially, vowed to rebuild its nuclear program. Okay, so that's the timeline. Let's pull back now and analyze the strategies. What were the successes, the limitations? Let's start with Israel. What were they trying to achieve? Pretty clear aims: stop the nuclear program, weaken Iran's military power, maybe shake the regime itself.
Right, and looking at the outcome, you'd have to call it, well, a partial success at best. The strikes definitely hurt Iran's infrastructure, no doubt, but the source points out that Fordo site, the deep one, it might still be operational, at least partly. So it wasn't a decisive kill shot on the nuclear program, more like a significant setback, a delay. It bought time, maybe, but didn't eliminate the threat.
And Iran's strategy, what do they rely on? We saw the missile retaliation, obviously, the Haj Qassem being the prime example. They also tried to use their regional proxies and just generally project resilience, show they could take the hit.
And they did remain intact. Despite the degraded military capacity, despite the economic pressure which was significant the regime itself held, it really showcased their determination, perhaps born from decades of sanctions and isolation, to absorb shocks and maintain their course and regional standing, more resilient than maybe some expected.
And then there's the U.S. role. Pivotal, as you said. We saw that shift, didn't we?
Yeah.
From just providing defensive support to Israel to launching direct offensive strikes. Fordo seems to have been a key factor there.
Absolutely. Trump's decision to intervene directly was likely what forced the ceasefire. It changed the calculus. But, as we touched on, it was risky. It risked dragging the U.S. deeper in. And interestingly, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the international dynamics, it also highlighted divisions back home in the U.S. about getting directly involved militarily.
Okay, but like any conflict, there's always more beneath the surface. Let's dig into some of those lesser-known aspects our source highlighted. First off, Iran's nuclear program might be more resilient than the strike suggests. Yeah, the source raises this really concerning possibility that Iran might still have secret nuclear sites. Places like Zanjarian, Gulab Dera are mentioned. And the assessment is they could potentially rebuild their capabilities within just a few years.
And what's really fascinating, or perhaps worrying, here is the IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog. Their access is limited. That makes verifying anything incredibly difficult. It poses this huge long-term challenge. How do you monitor Iran's activities if you can't see everything? It leaves a massive question mark.
We also need to talk about the internal situation in Iran. The economic problems, combined with something like the Evin prison strike, it undoubtedly fueled some level of unrest. There's a detail in the source, the appointment of a specific hardline figure, Brigadier General Mohammad Karami, to a key IRGC role on June 19th. That suggests the regime was genuinely worried about keeping control domestically, needing to clamp down.
That's a critical piece of intel. It hints at those internal vulnerabilities, right? The pressure points the regime was juggling, even while fighting externally, tells you a lot about their priorities.
And looking at the U.S. side again, those political risks were real. President Trump's decision to strike, it was unilateral, didn't have specific backing from Congress. And that reflected pretty clearly low public appetite in the U.S. for getting drawn into another long Middle East conflict.
Exactly. Which might suggest the ceasefire, from the U.S. perspective, wasn't just about stopping the fighting. It could also have been a strategic move to step back, avoid deeper entanglement, especially, with domestic politics and public opinion being what they were.
One last hidden point. The state of Iran's proxy network, often seen as a major strength, right? But the source notes that key allies, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon, were actually weaker, diminished from previous conflicts. This reduced Iran's ability to sort of project power regionally during this specific war.
That's true, and an important point about their capabilities at that moment. But I would add a note of caution there. These groups have shown resilience before. Rebuilding efforts could definitely shift that balance again in the future. Their current weakness isn't necessarily permanent.
Okay, so pulling it all together, what does this intense couple of weeks in June 2025 actually mean? The broader implications. Well, clearly the war put a strain on Iran economically and on its network of allies. At the same time, you could argue it reinforced Israel's military edge in the region, at least for now.
And the U.S. getting involved, even in that limited offensive way, definitely raised the global stakes. We saw the blip in oil markets, but also subtler shifts in regional alignments, like Saudi Arabia apparently giving tacit support to Israel. That signals ongoing changes in Gulf state thinking.
But at the end of the day, this ceasefire feels, well, fragile, doesn't it? The fundamental issues, Iran's nuclear ambitions on one side, Israel's security needs on the other, they haven't gone away. They're still there.
No, they haven't. It really was, as we said at the start, an intense but ultimately inconclusive chapter in this very long rivalry. Israel scored some tactical points, yes. Degraded infrastructure, sent a message. But Iran survived, and that potential to reconstitute its nuclear program hangs over everything.
And the U.S. left playing that really complex role, powerful enough to force a pause, but maybe hesitant to commit fully. So for you, listening to this deep dive, here's something to think about. Our sources suggest Iran could rebuild its nuclear program relatively quickly, maybe within years. And we know the IAEA can't see everything. So what does that really mean for long-term stability in the region under this fragile ceasefire? And how could the world even respond to future nuclear developments in Iran if key details stay hidden? Something to mull over. We encourage you, keep digging deeper yourself. Maybe look into the history of that Haj Qassem missile or track how those regional proxy groups evolve. There's always more beneath the surface.